I mentioned earlier that one of the big questions to arise from the American Revolution was not just will this new country be able to stand and become independent, but also what kind of country is it going to be? And we talked a little bit about that, the fact that immediately at the end of the war there was disagreement about the direction the country should go in certain things. Like, for example, what we talked about before was the question of free trade versus price and wage controls, regulations, if you will. And that trajectory is going to continue. But first, before we talk about that, let me just point out this book that came out near the end of the Revolution, Letters from an American Farmer, written by a Franco-American, Hector Saint-Jean de Crèvecoeur, who had left France when he was a young man and come to Canada during the French and Indian War, actually, where he was, I think, a lieutenant in the French army. And then when the war was over, he didn't go back to France or Canada. He stayed actually in the colony of New York and married an English colonist and became a farmer. And so these various letters that he wrote, fictionalized in the form, it was written in the form of letters to an imaginary person, described to his friends back in Europe, to his European audience, what America was like, so far as the animals and the farming and so forth, but also what Americans were like. What is this strange new creature called an American? And he wrote about that at length, trying to nail down the identity of these citizens of this new nation. And he found them very promising, and he himself was one of them. He was an American citizen. He didn't have a whole lot of good things to say about people out on the frontier. He thought they were little better than animals. But as far as the rest of the people, he thought that they were indeed very promising. Now, his book didn't do real well in the United States because everyone in the United States knew what an American was like, but it did really well in Europe. Also, I like to talk about him just because I like to say Hector Saint-Jean de Crèvecoeur. All right, well, let's now talk about the two differing views of the new country's future. And these views could be summed up, they could be personified in two men who are among those considered the main group of the founding fathers: Alexander Hamilton on the left and Thomas Jefferson on the right. The Hamiltonian approach and the Jeffersonian approach. Jefferson was closely allied with James Madison on most of these things, and also James Monroe. Hamilton had the support of John Adams and of George Washington. If you will recall, Hamilton was George Washington's assistant, his aide de camp during the war for quite a while. So each of these individuals had a plan for America. And each of them had a lot of support from other people who thought their plan sounded pretty good. So these became the two main views of which direction the country should go. Let's look first at Hamilton's plan. Hamilton, who remember was, as a young man, apprenticed to a merchant and who worked basically with merchants before he entered into politics. Hamilton wanted financial stability for the new country. He wanted to get economic support for the government from business. And he wanted the government to encourage economic development. In other words, a close relationship between the federal government and business, with the ultimate goal of making the United States a major commercial power and a major military power, similar to Great Britain. Now, Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, that's as high as he ever got. He did not become president, yet his picture is on the money, right? He's on a $10 bill. And that's because he was so influential and his ideas were so powerful and influential. So Hamilton is a business guy. Essentially, his view of America is focusing on the port cities and the industrial cities along the coast, along the Atlantic coast, in the original 13 states, and facing outward toward the ocean, facing the east, facing Europe across the way and the rest of the world, wanting to be a global power and to have a global economy. So his plan, his program, included doing things like establishing national credit worthiness. The United States was pretty deeply in debt. The very act of becoming independent and fighting that revolution created a lot of debt, and a lot of the individual states also had a lot of debt. Hamilton's goal then essentially was to pay off the national debt by creating a new national debt, except using interest-bearing bonds. And how that works is that the government would sell bonds to citizens. Let's say a $10 bond. Citizen buys that bond, gives $10 for it. Now the government's got $10, and the citizen has a piece of paper that says in the future their government will pay back that $10 plus some interest. So the citizen has an opportunity to make a long-term investment, but the government has money now to do the things it needs to do, not just pay off the debt, but other things that will enable them to then stimulate the economy so that they will be able to pay off those bonds in the future. So that's how that works. Hamilton also wanted to create a national bank, Bank of the United States, to oversee and regulate banking. He wanted to help pay for all this stuff with a tax on whiskey, which, by the way, the average American at this time period drank about somewhere between 5 to 7 times more alcohol per day than the average American does now. Part of the reason was it wasn't always safe to drink untreated water, and the distillation process would purify the water. Anyway, so that's what's sometimes called a luxury tax. So use the whiskey tax to help raise money. Also, he called for tariffs on imports and exports, another form of taxation, and government subsidies to businesses. So he wants to see the government give money to businesses to help businesses succeed, because when the businesses succeed, the economy will be stimulated and there will be more money then in circulation, and things will be better. That's the idea. And also he wanted to create a standing army. No more of this situation that happened with Shays' rebellion. Rather, there would be, whereas at the end of the revolution, basically everybody went home. There would be an army always in place. Some of his other long-term goals that are closely associated with the things that I just talked about included increased urbanization, increased manufacturing, and stimulation of business. So if you've got more manufacturing being done, that requires more laborers living in the city. So that requires the cities to grow. And all this is going to lead to the stimulation of business and the economy. So what kind of people tended to support Hamilton? Perhaps not surprisingly, financiers, people on Wall Street, loved his ideas. Manufacturers and merchants loved his ideas. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison did not love his ideas. They had a completely different approach. Their vision was instead, sometimes it's called the agrarian vision. A republic of independent farmers, yeoman farmers, Y-E-O-M-A-N. That means small family farms. Jefferson believed that the small family farm was the backbone of America and was the future of America. A small farm is self sufficient. A farmer can make just about anything he needs, and what he can't make with the little bit of stuff he has left over from his crops, he can trade for. So, more farms, more independent farms. That's going to require more land. That's going to require more expansion to the west. None of this stuff that Jefferson and Madison wanted is going to be helped in the least by having more financial ties to Great Britain. Now remember, Madison also had proposed the idea that more expansion to the west and making the country bigger would also create even more checks and balances. So the Jeffersonian approach required free trade without government interference. The Hamiltonian approach called for a lot of government involvement. Also, Jefferson, Madison, and their supporters, their followers, very suspicious about this whole standing army business. What happens when a strong central government has a standing army? Well, Great Britain had one, so that makes them very suspicious. It seemed as though the whole point of having a standing army was to control the citizens to them. Jefferson had several fears about Hamilton's approach. He feared that much federal power would create even more possibilities for corruption, which is what you also saw in Great Britain. He feared that much emphasis on business and manufacturing would make rich people richer, but wouldn't help anybody else, and in fact might well make poor people poorer. He also feared this bond business. So you can buy bonds, right? A lot of veterans, remember there's a big problem with paying veterans for their service. A lot of veterans were paid off in bonds, which were worthless at the moment, but could be redeemed later. Jefferson feared that speculators might swoop in and talk to these veterans who've got these bonds that really aren't worth anything right now, and the veterans are broke, right? They may be unemployed. They may be hungry. A speculator could say, you know, this $1 bond, you can't cash it in for a certain number of years, but I'll give you 10 cents for it right now, and then buy them all up. And essentially the veterans would be they'd get money, but they'd really be being defrauded. Also, Jefferson didn't like the whiskey tax because it was especially hard on his favorite people, farmers. Why? Well, a lot of farmers grew barley and or corn, which, if you just leave it sitting around for too long, will go bad. And it was difficult to ship this stuff. They didn't have good roads back then. They didn't have trains. They didn't have steamboats. So odds are, if you tried to ship your stuff for a long distance, it would go bad unless you converted it to liquid form by distilling it into alcohol. And that's what a lot of farmers did. Their crops basically went into making whiskey. And so this tax was going to be especially hard on them. There was also some disagreement about how to interpret the Constitution. Jefferson and his folks were what are still called strict constructionists. That means you go strictly by the wording in the Constitution, what it says, and what the people meant when they wrote it. So looking at it that way, the Constitution says absolutely nothing about national banks. Therefore, you can't have one because the Constitution doesn't call for it. Hamilton said, on the other hand, Hamilton and his followers were loose constructionists, which means that you look at the spirit of it. You don't get bound by the specifics of the wording. And Hamiltonians would look at the preamble to the Constitution where it said, that the government was put in place to promote the general welfare. All right? So if you say the National Bank isn't in the Constitution, Hamilton could say, yes, it is, because the Constitution says promote the general welfare, and a bank would provide for the general well-being of the country. Therefore, if it's good for the country, you're allowed to do it. These types of arguments, by the way, loose constructionism versus strict constructionism, pay attention to the news anytime there's a death on the Supreme Court and they're looking to fill that spot, because these things are things people still argue about passionately. The two opposing views of what the country was supposed to be, one held by Alexander Hamilton principally and his allies, and the other by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, sort of came to a head after the new government was officially formed when Washington was sworn in 1789. The new Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, remember, part of Hamilton's plan was to pay off the debt of the nation and of the individual states. He also wanted to have more engagement with the rest of the world financially. Well, he had a plan in which the federal government would take over the debts of all the states. So the states would be absolved and the federal government would pay them. And they would pay them by selling bonds, including some very highly priced bonds that would mostly be bought up by rich businessmen because they viewed it as a good investment. And then they were going to cash out those bonds, the federal government, by another tax on tariffs. So that's where that was going to go. That was Hamilton's plan, but has to get through Congress. And it was opposed in the House of Representatives by James Madison. And it was roughly divided. Neither side was really able to get a win on this one. So a compromise was a series of meetings led to a compromise between the two approaches. And this meeting between Hamilton and Madison took place at the home of Thomas Jefferson, not the plantation, Monticello in Virginia, but Jefferson's residence in New York City, which he had to have because New York City is the capital and he's the Secretary of State. So essentially, they had a meal, the three of them, and sat around the table and tried to work out how to solve this problem. Jefferson was kind of convinced, somewhat at least, by Hamilton's idea that this was going to make the United States not only solvent, but make them more powerful. However, Madison feared it would make the federal government too powerful. That even though, let's give up our debts and let the federal government pay them, that's too much control at the national level. But also, Madison was concerned because Virginia, the state that he was from and one of whose districts he was representing, had already pretty much paid off their debt from the war, and so had most of the southern states. It was the northern states that had the really big debts. So his fear was that Hamilton's plan was essentially going to help out northern speculators and businessmen and put them basically a step up over the people in the South. So a compromise was reached, a bargain was made. Essentially, Jefferson and Madison came around to saying to Hamilton, go ahead with your plan. And this included all the other stuff, really, that he had wanted to do, except drop that whole part about subsidies to business, about the federal government giving money to big business to kind of stimulate the economy. Drop that part And you've got to do something for the South, because the Southern politicians and leaders and people are going to be upset by this deal because it really doesn't help them. And so there had already been talk about building a new national capital. So what Jefferson wanted to see was that capital to be built in the South, the northern part of the South, but still the South, along the Potomac River. And so partly that was a concession to the southern states. Also, it has been speculated that from some things that Jefferson said, he wanted the capital away from New York City as far as possible, because he wanted it away from Wall Street. He felt like being too close to Wall Street, too close to New York City, where all these business deals were constantly being made, sort of put the government in danger of being exposed to financial corruption. So get them away from there. As we all know, there is no issue with the government having to deal with corruption because of money, he said sarcastically. Yes, Thomas Jefferson was correct in that concern, but as it proved, moving the capital wasn't going to help. Anyway, they agreed to do this. Congress passed Hamilton's plan, and they also passed the plan to build a new capital from scratch along the Potomac River. George Washington got to select the actual site where they were going to build it, and they immediately moved the capital temporarily until construction was done from New York City to Philadelphia. So they were in Philadelphia for the largest part of Washington's time in office, except for that first year or so in New York, and then Adams' term in office as well. So here's where they decided to put the District of Columbia, and Columbia being the female form of Columbus, and sometimes being used kind of interchangeably with the word America. The District of Columbia, the idea was the capital shouldn't actually be in any state, because that would be favoring one state. It should be an autonomous region. And so this area along the north bank of the Potomac River was selected, and initially a 10 square mile area was kind of carved out to build this city. It was right in between Georgetown, Maryland, and Alexandria, Virginia, in the South. Now, I know that today we don't really think of Maryland as the South, but at that time it very much was. In fact, the Mason-Dixon line separated Pennsylvania from Maryland. Maryland was a slave state, and that was how the system developed. And this had actually been set up in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, I believe, where it called for a 10 square mile district to be ceded or donated by states for the location of a new capital, but it didn't say where. So that's the part that was up in the air, and that's the part that was decided essentially at this dinner table bargain. All right, well, the law was passed for building a new capital, as well as for Hamilton's plan, and work started almost immediately. Plans started to be drawn up by 1791 to build a whole new city, which took about 10 years. So it was around 1800 when the Capitol was finished and the White House was finished. So Washington, again, he spent his presidency a little bit in New York, the rest in Philadelphia. Adams spent most of his in Philadelphia, but ended up in the White House. Now, for the building of the city. A couple of individuals are noteworthy. First, the architect who designed the layout of the city. He was a guy named Pierre L'Enfant, who was French, believe it or not. At the age of 23, back in 1777, he had come over to join the forces of the Marquis de Lafayette in the American Army as an engineer. And then he had stayed in the United States when the war was over, and started going by Peter Charles L'Enfant after that. So he was the principal architect. The first step, though, was surveying the land and drawing out the boundaries of this district. And one of the people most involved in that was the surveyor, Benjamin Banneker, whom we've mentioned before. He had written that scientific almanac. He was a free person of color from Maryland. His father had previously been a slave. He's the one that Thomas Jefferson couldn't quite believe that he actually did all this stuff without help from a white person. Anyway, turns out he helped to establish Washington, D.C. Well, as the new government was being established, remember that was when Washington was inaugurated in early 1789. Around that same time, in France, there was a revolution beginning. The French Revolution, which officially started on July 14th, 1789, with the storming of the Bastille, which was a prison there in France, where an angry group of people came in there and stormed the prison and freed the prisoners. And essentially this revolution, as you're probably at least somewhat familiar, led to the overthrow of the French monarchy and the death of the French king and queen. And the people established a republic. Now, it would be very easy to have an entire semester-long course just on the French Revolution, but this is U.S. history, so we won't do that. I just wanted to give a quick overview of what happened, and the fact that the violence got really bad during this revolution. Eventually, huge numbers of members of the aristocracy in particular were executed. And eventually, this new French Republic wound up being controlled by a guy named Napoleon Bonaparte, which even before that happened, there was already major tension between the new Republic of France and all the other countries in Europe. Why? Because all the other countries in Europe had monarchs, and having your neighbor country cut off the monarch's head is not a good precedent. You don't want your own people trying to do that if you're the monarch, right? So basically, there was a long period of war between France and essentially everybody else in Europe, but primarily against England. All right, well, now, because this is U.S. history, we're going to look at how this played out in the United States, and it's going to be a very influential and important event because just like there were two differing views on the economy and the direction the country should go, there were also two differing views by the same people on how to react to the French Revolution. Thomas Jefferson loved it. He loved France. He had served in France as ambassador. He believed that the French Revolution was a blow for Republican liberty. And in fact, with the success of the Revolution, that led to the establishment of really, what initially was only the second democratic republic in the world after the United States, although it didn't remain that democratic. Anyhow, Jefferson was all for it. Remember what he had said in reference to Shays' rebellion. Essentially, a little rebellion now and then is good, because the tree of liberty must be quenched with the blood of patriots and tyrants. The struggle has to continue. Jefferson, again, I want to remind you, usually down for a good revolution. Hamilton, however, and remember that Alexander Hamilton had already shown himself, even during the Revolution and afterward, despite the fact he was fighting against England, he liked a lot of things about England. He was a bit of an Anglophile. And also Hamilton feared mob anarchy. So he was on the side of the English in this war between England and France. And as it turns out, most of the people who subscribed to Jefferson's views about the economy and where the country should go agreed with him about siding with France. And most of the ones who sided with Hamilton on those things sided with him on this too. As you can imagine, for example, John Adams, well established, I think, in our lectures as someone who didn't like mob action and viewed the French Revolution as mob action. So him, John Jay, George Washington, they were on the side of Hamilton and of England in this. Well, as the war between Britain and France continued, there started to be tensions between the British and the United States. Specifically, in 1793 and 94, without warning, the British Navy started just seizing American ships, merchant ships that were involved in trade, because the U.S. was trading with both the English and the French. So the British just started seizing their ships and taking them and keeping them, and taking the crews that were on them and impressing them, which doesn't mean they did a little dance for them. It means that basically they drafted them into the British Navy against their will. So 300 ships. You can imagine how many sailors that would be. You could also imagine how well that went over in the United States, which was not very well at all. 1794, and this is odd, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay, went on a mission to Great Britain to try to negotiate some kind of a treaty, some kind of a deal about the conflicts between Britain and the U.S. And there were several things that the U.S. wanted. Number one, stop kidnapping our sailors. Stop taking our ships. Number two, abandon the forts that the British still were maintaining in the Northwest Territory on U.S. soil. And then another thing that the U.S. wanted was for the British government to compensate slave owners whose slaves had run away and joined the British Army and hadn't been given back. Well, Jay met with the British and made a deal. The deal was, here's what the British got. The United States gave Great Britain most favored status, most favored trade status. That means that if Britain offered the U.S. a deal on something and any other country offered them a better deal, Britain got the deal because they're the BFF. Now that was controversial because the U.S. already had that deal with France, so they took that away from France and gave it to England. What did the U.S. get? The British did leave those forts, and that was about it. Essentially, the slaveholders were not compensated, and they didn't stop impressing sailors. Jay essentially decided just to leave them alone when it came to what they did on the high seas. This, like I said, was very controversial. It infuriated Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and their supporters, as it also infuriated the French, because it seemed like the U.S. gave away a lot and didn't really get much at all. Another important incident, or rather a series of incidents, occurred in 1794 that was going to highlight division in the new country, known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, remember, Alexander Hamilton, part of his plan to finance these programs that he wanted to put through was to put a tax on whiskey. Actually, on all liquor. It was called whiskey tax because there was more whiskey than anything else, but it applied to rum too. So this was the first domestic product in the United States to be taxed by the federal government. If you will recall, Thomas Jefferson was opposed to this idea because he believed it would be unfair and unduly hard on farmers, because particularly farmers in the western part of the United States who were a little more far-flung and who couldn't get their grain crops to a market without them spoiling, so they frequently would convert them to liquid form, to liquor. And in fact, out on the frontier, that liquor was often used as a form of exchange even, rather than money. Well, there was opposition to these taxes by people in western Pennsylvania, which is where most of the Whiskey Rebellion, well, all the Whiskey Rebellion took place, but there was also opposition in all of the Appalachian regions, the frontier Appalachian regions of the United States, which was essentially the western part of several of the original 13 colonies. So you had western Pennsylvania, you had western Virginia, western North Carolina, and the new state of Kentucky, essentially, where people resisted paying these taxes. And by resisted, I mean they refused to pay the taxes. And when the tax collector came, as is demonstrated in this picture, very frequently that tax collector would be beaten and tarred and feathered, where they, well, basically they cover you with tar and then pour a bunch of feathers over you, and it's really hard to get off, and ride you out of town on a rail, which means basically a rail, a long pole that they would straddle you on. As you can imagine, that was very uncomfortable. And so they were doing these things all through the early 1790s and refusing to pay their taxes. In 1794, U.S. Marshal went into western Pennsylvania to arrest some of the farmers who had not paid their taxes or gotten their stills registered and so forth. And it led to violence as a large crowd of farmers gathered together and shots were exchanged, and some people were hurt and killed. Most of them on the side of the farmers. I think one soldier was killed, but there were several similar incidents involving even a contingent of the U.S. Army that was sent out there, and there were skirmishes, no large-scale battles, but people were getting hurt and killed. Well, President Washington determined that the area was in insurrection, and so he called up the militias of several states. Pennsylvania, most of the militia coming from the east, kind of similar to that situation in Massachusetts with Shays' Rebellion. Also, militia from Virginia and I think Maryland. A force of 13,000 men in all. Now, they didn't get many volunteers because a lot of the people who were citizens of those states sympathized with the farmers. So there was a draft, conscription. People were forced to serve in these militias. And George Washington, President of the United States, got on his blue coat and got on his horse and led the troops himself, at least to the rallying point where they all came together, where he then examined the troops, 13,000 of them in all, determined that was enough to handle what was needed, and so he didn't continue forward, leading them directly into battle. He turned it over instead to former General Henry Lee, alias Light Horse Harry Lee, who's the cousin of Richard Henry Lee that we've talked about a lot, and the father of one Robert E. Lee. At this time, Light Horse Harry Lee was the governor of Virginia, so he takes over, and then a colonel under his command actually led the troops. So the troops show up in western Pennsylvania, a very large show of force, and the farmers scattered. So there was never a huge amount of bloodshed, but this was controversial. This was problematic from two different perspectives, right? From the perspective of President Washington, Vice President Adams, John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton, and others. These were, once again, farmers indulging in too much liberty and in insurrection. Now, the farmers themselves were using the tactics of the Sons of Liberty, including putting up liberty poles, just like the Sons of Liberty had done. And they were actually claiming that they were doing the same thing that had been done essentially 30 years earlier against the British. Of course, Washington and those others I mentioned believed that, it's a very different thing to rebel against a government that you have had representation in electing. Meanwhile, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and others, but especially Thomas Jefferson, believed that this was an incredibly bad thing to happen on the part of the government, of having levied this tax to begin with, and then of sending in this huge, 13,000 men at that time was huge army to control the people. So here you've got, again, two very different viewpoints. And all this stuff is kind of leading these two sides to a break of sorts. Now, I do want to point out something, that sometimes you will see this meme going around Facebook. I've seen it, where it looks like George Washington is saying that everybody should have guns so they can overthrow a tyrannical government. That particular meme is not accurate. That's not something that he said. But to really get an idea of how George Washington felt about using arms to take up arms against your duly elected government, bear in mind that when someone did that while he was president, he got on his horse and personally led the army to put them down. So you should take that into consideration, I think. All right, well, all these differing viewpoints, two different camps with totally different views on what kind of economy the United States should have, what kind of foreign policy the United States should have, how the people should be approached. All this is going to lead to the establishment of two political parties.